Welcome to Beat 'em Up City. This week I have a very special episode cooked up. I'll be talking all about Double Dragon, the first in the long-running beat 'em up series and arguably one of the greatest games of all time. Double Dragon was so popular, in fact, that it was ported to many different platforms. For this video, I've chosen what I find to be the most high-profile and interesting versions of Double Dragon. We'll be looking at the differences in what makes each version good, bad, and unique. At this time, I would like to point out, this channel is really not focused on being a gaming history trivia channel. I really kind of got away from that because I wanted to talk more about the gameplay experience. Getting into the history and the trivia behind these games can be fun, but I find that it's just something I don't have a lot of time to get into. So that's where I really want you to help me out. In the comments, discuss the history, discuss the trivia, tell me and each other what you know about these games. I'm going to focus a lot more just on the experience of the games themselves. And the reason why I'm talking about this for this video is it does go pretty deep. And I try to get some history and trivia in as much as I can, but really it's more about what it feels like to play the game and how fun that experience is. So just bear that in mind. I think there are a lot of other channels that do history and trivia a lot better. So if you have some more information about these games that I don't, absolutely in the comments, let everybody know, let me know, let everyone else know what you know about these games. Let's get that discussion going. So for this comparison, I've selected the original arcade game, the very famous NES version, the impressive Master System port, and the unlicensed Genesis port. But I added at the end the GBA version. That slipped in way under the radar, but it's absolutely worth talking about, so let's dive in. Released in arcades in 1987, Double Dragon is considered by many to be the granddaddy of all beat-em-ups. Taito made this game to be the spiritual successor to a game called Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun, which you may know as Renegade. So maybe Double Dragon is more like a great uncle to the beat-em-up genre. The Kunio saga and the Double Dragon franchise would eventually grow independently of one another, but the same genes are present in games like River City Ransom, which I look forward to covering down the line. Double Dragon tells the story of two unnamed warriors battling through 4 dangerous territories to rescue a woman who has been kidnapped by a gang called the Black Warriors. A simple story with very little background, it gives players a simple and tangible objective: rescue the girl. The player characters were originally unnamed but were later given the names Hammer and Spike for the US release. As expected, the players move through a 2.5D environment, fighting bad guys until eventually meeting a boss at the end of each level. I know this seems pretty cookie cutter now, but at the time, this was one of the first games to do that. There are many waves of enemies in each stage, and they just keep coming. It's a real challenge meant to eat up all your quarters, but be careful because you can hurt your partner in 2-player mode. Enemies can punch and kick, use weapons, throw you, and even grab and hold you while their buddies work you over. Luckily, you have quite an arsenal of moves at your disposal. There are 3 buttons: punch, kick, and jump. However, you can use different inputs and combinations to deliver a number of special techniques, from a headbutt that breaks up close-range combat, an elbow that covers foes advancing from behind, and a shoulder throw. Unfortunately, thrown enemies do not damage other enemies, which is kind of a bummer. This was a very advanced moveset for the time. In fact, a lot of beat-em-ups that came after didn't have this much depth. You also have the ability to climb ladders and other objects. You need to be super careful in some areas because there are traps and pitfalls all over the game. As easily as you can knock or throw enemies into them, you can also fall in yourself. It happens accidentally more often than you might think. Positioning yourself to take advantage of this is crucial, especially given the large number of enemies you'll be facing. A variety of weapons is at your disposal, including knives, bats, whips, boxes, and oil cans that you can pick up and throw at enemies or kick to roll them through your foes. You'll notice that the graphics are also very nice here with large, colorful sprites. While many enemies are simply palette swaps of one another, there are enough enemy types to keep things interesting. The soundtrack is iconic, and the original arcade cabinet sounds great. Unfortunately, the game is a little too demanding for its own hardware and suffers from a great deal of slowdown, especially when a lot of enemies are on screen. This can really hurt the gameplay experience. The 4 missions are all quite short and they only take a few minutes each. At the end of the game, you'll find the captive girl rather disturbingly tied to the wall. After a short gauntlet, you'll fight the boss of the Black Warriors, Willie. He's the only gangster who had the foresight to bring a gun with him. If you're playing a 2-player game, you'll have to duke it out with your partner to see who wins the affections of the girl. It's no wonder at all that such a popular and well-done game would be ported to the most popular game console at the time, the Nintendo Entertainment System. This is the version I think most of us are familiar with, and it was released in 1988. While fundamentally the same, this game has some major differences from its arcade counterpart. It is here that our heroes receive their names, Billy and Jimmy Lee. The girl is Billy's girlfriend, Marion. This is canonized for the life of the franchise. The downgrade in graphics is obvious, but the new sprites used for the NES game have so much character, charm, and personality that they really make up for it. Many sprites are very different, most notably Lee, the hero lookalike, is replaced by the purple Mo looking character. The color palette is much smaller, but it's put to good use here, and most importantly, the gameplay is vastly improved. No slowdown at all in this game. Instead, the action is always fast and fluid. Unfortunately, the 2-player version has both players taking turns instead of playing together. Both players play as Billy Lee. This is most likely due to hardware limits. This port was handled by Technos Japan, and true to form for an NES arcade port, great effort was undertaken to make this a unique version of the source material. First, with only 2 buttons on the controller, the large arsenal of moves had to be put together somewhat differently. Not only was this done successfully, but a number of moves were added, including a ground and pound and a tatsumaki, which to this day I can't seem to actually ever do. You don't have all the moves right away, however. The NES Double Dragon game uses an expensive and experience point system. You start with only a punch, kick, and jump. You cannot do a jump kick, combo, throw, headbutt, or any other special move. Defeating enemies grants you points which eventually grant a heart. Each heart unlocks a new special move. The missions are much longer than those in the arcade version, and the game is much harder overall. There are fewer enemies and the weapons disappear when you move to a new screen, however they are all still here. There's quite a lot more jumping and platforming. Many missions have 2D sections that require some awkward jumping. Mission 3 has a unique feature where the stage will loop indefinitely unless you walk into the cave to enter one such area. These are really challenging, and you're constantly in danger of falling into a pit. This hurts the most because of your hard limit of lives and continues. As an aside, when I was a kid, I didn't know you had to go in the cave, so I never beat Mission 3 until I was a grown up. The final stage has a boss gauntlet that is nearly impossible to get through. If you do manage to survive and defeat Willie, you'll come face to face with Jimmy Lee, the true leader of the Black Warriors. Most intriguing of all is Mode B, in which 1 or 2 players can participate in a head-to-head battle. Players can choose one of the Lee brothers or one of a handful of enemy characters. The sprites used in this version are unique because they only have 2 characters on screen at a time, so I think they could use larger and more detailed sprites. Unfortunately, you can only fight against yourself if you're doing it in 1 player, so that kinda stinks. The music in this version is also really excellent. It's certainly the standout version, although it is one of many. Next, let's take a look at the Sega Master System version. In particular, I want to talk about this version because it's a much closer arcade port on an 8-bit system, but also because I remember being really blown away by it when I played it at a friend's house as a kid. Also released in 1988 and ported by Sega themselves, this game has much improved graphics over the NES, but the assets are really similar looking. I really wonder why the 2 ports that were developed independently of one another would have such similar sprites. My best guess is that the sprites must have been provided by Taito, but let me know in the comments if you know better. While there are some changes due to technical limits, the stages are much more similar to those of the arcade version. Unfortunately, the controls are terrible, and the general playability is very poor. Most of the special moves are intact and they have similar inputs to their NES counterpart. Two players can play at the same time, which is a huge check mark in the plus column for this version, even if it doesn't play that great. Remember, this is the closest to the arcade you could get in your home, despite its many flaws. You do have unlimited continues here, up until the final stage, which I always thought was really weird. This is a shame because the final stage is incredibly difficult. You can keep your continues if you manage to land 10 back spin kicks before you die in the last level. A really interesting change is that Willie's name was changed to Jeff in this version, and the final boss is a palette swap of the brothers and his name is Willie. The music is okay, but the Sega Master System didn't have great sound. The Japanese version has FM synthesis audio, which is way better, but doesn't quite save the soundtrack here. I think the NES version is a better game overall, but this is absolutely, without question, the more faithful port. Now, let's jump forward to 1992. Did you know that Double Dragon was ported to Genesis? I didn't, until very recently. This is an unlicensed port. This was 1992. Genesis and Mega Drive owners already had Streets of Rage, and Double Dragon 3 was already out. Super Double Dragon would come out soon, but Genesis owners had never received a port of Double Dragon. So a company called Ballistic, which was owned by Accolade, decided to remedy this on their own by going off the grid and releasing a totally unlicensed port of the Double Dragon arcade game. The Genesis 3-button controller was perfect for the arcade control scheme. This is almost a direct copy of the arcade game, but it does have a really bad color palette, but that's just the Genesis though. The Genesis had a really bad color palette. There's really not a lot you could do for it. On the other hand, this runs a lot better than the arcade version, and it doesn't have all the slowdown that the cabinet has. But, because it's an unlicensed game, the quality control really isn't great. The music is awful. It's annoying. It is grinding. I'll put it in the background, but oh my gosh, you're gonna wish I didn't. Finally, the controls are stiff, so if you have a Genesis and want to experience the closest possible arcade version of Double Dragon, it might be worth tracking down, but I wouldn't go out of your way. Our final stop on this timeline, though, is 2003, so we're talking now 8 years after that unlicensed Genesis port. Did you know that a new port of Double Dragon was released in 2003? Because I didn't. Until recently. I was making this video, I had no idea. I was just looking up, trivia, trying to find random facts, and I found out that there is a Game Boy Advance version of Double Dragon called, of course, Double Dragon Advance, and that was made by Atlas. Now, anyone familiar with the GBA probably knows that Nintendo had this really bad habit of releasing ports of old games and just slapping the word Advance on the end to make a few bucks. Although, sometimes these games are actually way better versions or even definitive editions, and that is absolutely true of this one. This game epitomizes that ideal. For some context, by 2003, Double Dragon was more or less dead. The canon series ended with that terrible fighting game based on the cartoon, and there were a couple of Neo Geo fighting games in the late 90s. There's one that had the license, and one that didn't have the license, and changed all the character names. But let me know if you would like me to explore those as video topics in the future, because they are pretty cool games. But for all intents and purposes, the license was dead and buried. Super Double Dragon was the last proper game to be released with this license. So while the rest of the world thought the franchise was dead and buried, Atlas had different ideas. When I saw this, I was really expecting like a port of the NES game, but that's not at all what Double Dragon Advance is. It is an upgraded port of the arcade game, with improved graphics and gameplay, as well as new enemies, and 4 additional missions interspersed with the existing missions that we all remember from the arcade. Not only are the graphics greatly improved and more content added, but the moveset is more varied than ever, including crouching and dashing moves and much more. You can finally hurt enemies by throwing them at each other, which is awesome. A block button has been added, which also allows you to drop equipped weapons to pick up a new one, which you couldn't do in Double Dragon prior to this. On that note, several weapons have been added, including Eskrima and Nunchuck, both of which are a lot of fun. The existing weapons have been upgraded to be more fun to use, the whip is way better. Some of the player character animations are very reminiscent of Bruce Lee. It is really, really, really cool. You can tell a lot of inspiration was pulled from Double Dragon 2 and Super Double Dragon, A lot of the enemies and some of the levels were definitely based on those games. There's even a single-player Double Dragon mode that allows one player to control both Lee brothers, but it's really awkward because you have to press select to swap between them, and you can only control one at a time, so it's not very fun. But it plays beautifully. It's really fluid, it's very responsive, and as many as 6 enemies can be on screen at any given time. It's sort of like a beautiful chaos. The comic book style cutscenes have been added between the levels, and they tell this new story of this post-apocalyptic world where the Lee brothers teach martial arts to people in order to help them survive in a harsh world overrun with gangs and violence. It's all very neo-futuristic, you know. It's a really amazing game though. The GBA has always been known for not having the best audio, but compared to other versions of the game, this one actually does have, I think, the best soundtrack. This GBA game is excellent. I wouldn't even call it a port. I would call it a remaster at the very least. But it's dangerously close to being an entire reimagining. There's no question that all the original game is iconic, and the NES version is a unique classic that has stood the test of time. But the GBA version is an incredible remaster and an upgrade of everything that made the original game excellent. So if you haven't played the GBA version, I strongly recommend that you do as soon as possible if you're a Double Dragon fan. And that is it. That is my comparison of what I feel are the 4 most important versions of Double Dragon. I hope you enjoyed this comparison. And until next time, game over.